Hey, Wonderhussy here, out in the middle of nowhere. And when I say the middle of nowhere, boy howdy do I mean it. Only it's not the same middle of nowhere that I normally travel around. No sir, I'm all the way out in Oklahoma on the Great Plains, which if you've ever been to or driven across the Great Plains, you know there's a whole lot of nothing. And I would argue that this might be the most middle of nowhere place I've ever been, including Death Valley. Okay, I'm pulled over here at the side of one of the loneliest highways you ever did see, cutting right through the heart of the plains. But I pulled over here at this little roadside turnout with a very interesting monument that tells you just exactly how deep in the real middle of nowhere I am. That's right, I might think I live in the middle of nowhere because my house is on the edge of Death Valley, but I don't live in a place officially known as No Man's Land. Believe it or not, No Man's Land was the actual semi-official name of the last little corner of the continental United States to be quote-unquote civilized. Okay, back in the frontier days, what would eventually become known as the Oklahoma Panhandle was actually part of Texas. But when Texas joined the Union as a slave-holding state, per the Missouri Compromise, its northern boundary couldn't extend north of latitude line 3630. So this funky little strip of land between the borders of Texas to the south, Colorado and Kansas to the north, New Mexico Territory to the west, and the so-called Cherokee Outlet, which was basically a reservation where the government forced all the Cherokee Indians to the east, this little strip wasn't part of any state, and so it became known as No Man's Land. Because it really was. Think about it. It was totally lawless. This was back in the 1880s, 70s. It says it was called No Man's Land until 1890. Golly, there was no rule of law out here, you know? Like, well, if you rode your horse down into Texas, you'd have to face the wrath of the Texas Rangers. And if you rode your horse up into Kansas to Dodge City, why then you'd have to face the wrath of U.S. Marshal Matt Dillon. And I guess more or less the same if you rode that way into New Mexico or that way into Cherokee country. Ooh, I hate to think what would happen to you if you rode your horse into Cherokee country. But anyway, if you stayed in that little sweet spot, which today is the Oklahoma Panhandle, why, you are completely free from the oppressive thumb of the man. There was no rule of law, and I think that's why there were a lot of desperados and outlaws and very, very, very bad hombres populating this desolate country. And when I say desolate, I mean desolate. There is nothing out here but miles and miles and miles and miles of prairie grass, which is looking kind of dry and parched. And there's a really good reason for that, because not only are we right on the boundary of No Man's Land, that sign said we are about to enter No Man's Land. I'm driving back from Arkansas after the eclipse, so I'm approaching from the east. I just hit, I guess, the eastern edge of the Oklahoma Panhandle, and so this sign says, you are now entering old No Man's Land. Well, it's also the 100th meridian. Okay, it says right here, the Cherokee Outlet stopped at the 100th meridian, which today is the line separating Texas from Oklahoma. Like if you look on the map at the Texas Panhandle, there's like a very straight line separating it from Oklahoma. Well, that's the 100th meridian. Now, if you know anything about water and water rights and the whole conundrum of the eternal drought we find ourselves in here in the western U.S., well, the 100th meridian might sound kind of familiar to you. It's the line that was identified way back in the 1880s, I think, by John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran who was the first white man to explore the Grand Canyon. Well, he was one of the first white men to really explore the West fully, and when he went back east to give his report to the president, he gave a talk in front of Congress saying, hey guys, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but all the lands west of the 100th meridian are basically arid desert and unsuitable for large-scale agriculture. Remember that? It's a quote that's been coming back to haunt everyone in the West these last few dry, thirsty years. Well, basically, John Wesley Powell was right, and it only took another 40 or 50 years for his words to prove especially prescient. Okay, prescient is just a fancy word for, it was almost like he could see into the future. Because wouldn't you know it, even though John Wesley Powell told the fine gentleman in Congress that the lands west of the 100th meridian were unsuitable for large-scale agriculture, that didn't stop people from settling the West, no siree. In the finest tradition of American pioneers, they all loaded their wagons and headed west and grabbed as much land as they could in California, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma. And I guess thanks in large part to the railroads selling them all kinds of pipe dreams, well, a lot of them started small family farms in this arid, waterless, treeless landscape. Now, you might think, golly, Wonderhussy, who in their right mind could possibly grow anything in a dry landscape like this? Well, okay, there's not a lot of creeks and rivers, but there is a huge underground aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer. You might have heard of it. It's this huge underground lake, I guess, essentially, under the whole Great Plains, and I can't remember how many 100 million gallons of water were thought to be in it. I mean, I'm sure they're already sucking it dry pretty quick, but yeah, thanks to that aquifer, all a homesteader had to do was build one of those really charming little windmills that you see on, the classic old farmstead with the little creaking, squeaking metal windmill. All you needed was one of those little windmills, and you could pump all the water you needed out of this Ogallala Aquifer and water your cows, water your pigs, and water your crops. And again, you might think it's completely bonkers to even think about growing a crop on ground like this. I mean, this is like it's nothing but dead brush and, well, the odd bit of tumbleweed. Anyway, that's right. The magnificent, wild lawlessness of no man's land was eventually tamed and settled by farmers. So if you know anything about American history or Broadway musicals, if you've seen Oklahoma, well, I guess the reason it's called the Sooner State is Oklahoma was this Cherokee outlet, but then I guess the government reneged on their deal with the Cherokee and moved them somewhere else, and so they opened up this whole Oklahoma territory to settlement. And I guess by that point, no man's land had just sort of been glommed onto it, and that's why Oklahoma has that funky pot shape to this day. See? Never say you didn't learn anything from the Wonderhussy channel. Anyway, in 1907, I guess the government just opened up that entire chunk of land to settlement. And so there's some famous painting that some guy did of all these crazy land-hungry, speculators and settlers just rushing to grab. I guess it was like first come, first serve. If you could grab your plot of land, well, then the government would give it to you as long as you promised to farm it, I think. And so people did. There's another monument over here showing, it shows here that we are in Beaver County. Don't laugh. And these are all the little towns that were settled by these settlers who got here sooner than the next guy and were able to claim some land and start a little homestead. I'm pretty sure that's why Oklahoma is called the Sooner State. So anyway, basically Oklahoma was the last territory that you could claim free land in. Think about that. The pioneers started going to California in the 1840s, 1850s, and boy, as long as you could drag all your stuff across the country and survive cholera and Indian attacks and, starvation and dying of thirst, well, the land was yours for the taking, and folks back then got some pretty juicy properties. But, as the decades went by, the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, then there was the railroad, so it was easy. Anybody could come out. Well, all the land got gobbled up. And so by the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, there wasn't that much land left. And so if you wanted a stake of the American dream, Oklahoma was the last place you could grab a piece of land. And so I'm sure some of these Sooners You know, Oklahoma is actually a very varied, geographically speaking, state. I just drove across it. I should know. The east side of Oklahoma is relatively green and lush, and there's lots of water. That's the side of the state on the other side of the 100th meridian. So if you grabbed land over there, you were good to go. But these poor folks who didn't get anything until they released no man's land, well, they were facing a pretty brutal existence. Okay, not only is it dry as a bone, it's also blasting windy out here most of the time, and there's no trees to cut down to build houses. These guys had to build their houses out of the dirt itself. I guess they would, well, because it's prairie grass, or it was all covered by prairie grasses naturally evolved to withstand these blasting winds. Okay, when there's like a 50-mile-an-hour wind whipping across this grass, it doesn't just get ripped up and fly out because it has a very extensive network of roots, I guess, like a really gnarly root system holding it into the earth. And that root system kind of held the dirt together, so when the farmers would cut these long strips of sod, they could chop them into bricks, kind of like making an adobe house out west, or I should say out farther west. But they didn't even bake it. They just cut chunks of wet land, and they had to cut it when it was wet, because when it's dry, it's too hard to cut. So I guess after a rain, they would go through and they would cut these bricks and stack them up and build these actual sod houses out of dirt bricks. But unlike adobe, they didn't fire it at all. They didn't bake it dry. So it was just wet dirt walls, wet dirt ceiling. Like the whole house was wet dirt, which meant your house was full of centipedes, creepy crawlers, rattlesnakes. But that's what they had, and they were happy to have it because, by golly, they were on their own land. And if you've ever chafed under the yoke of having to pay rent to a landlord, you know how awesome that feeling is when you finally buy your own place, or say you're lucky enough to actually pay off your mortgage, and so now even the bank doesn't own your house anymore, and you have your own land. Like that feeling of owning your own piece of property where no one can raise the rent on you, nobody can kick you out unless it's the federal government and they have some kind of eminent domain project, but that's a different story. Anyway, you know what I mean. It's a good feeling, and it's something that most humans aspire to, having their own little piece of land, even if it means you have to live in a house made out of mud full of centipedes and rattlesnakes, farming a dry ass plot like this. And I don't mean to bag on the high plains. I can actually totally see the beauty of living in a place like this. I mean, it's nothing but wide open spaces and huge blue skies. There's a real sense of freedom in a landscape this vast. But there was one group of Americans who were not so enthused by all these settlers coming out here and building these sod houses and busting up the prairie to grow wheat. I guess the price of wheat was really high in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So all these settlers came out here and tore up the prairie grass to plant wheat crops. You know, they had families to feed, and they wanted to go into town and, you know, buy a piece of penny candy and a sack of flour, and they had needs. So wheat was the way to pay the bills, and so that's what they did. They tore up all these prairie grasses with all those little roots holding down the soil to feed their families, which didn't sit well with the cowboys and ranchers in the area, who knew that the prairie grass was actually valuable, not just for grazing their cattle, but also for keeping the relentlessly blasting winds from blowing the ground away, which is exactly what ended up happening a few decades later. That's right, this part of Oklahoma, the Panhandle, no man's land, was the epicenter of the Great American Dust Bowl. Okay, remember the Grapes of Wrath, Woody Guthrie, John Steinbeck, Dorothea Lange? Those giant clouds of dust just descended on this area and literally choked a lot of people out. I mean, you can look up pictures of it. People used to wear gas masks, or had to wear gas masks. You know, people complain about wearing masks nowadays. These Dust Bowl folks 90 years ago had a jump on you all. They used to wear surgical masks just out and about because they couldn't breathe. These giant, I mean, you can look them up online, giant clouds of dust came howling through here, I guess because there was a prolonged drought in the 1930s, and so as much water as they were pumping out of their out of the aquifer with their little windmills, it wasn't enough. They couldn't irrigate the fields. Everything dried up and blew away. And because there was no more prairie grass holding down the sod, the soil just got real loose and crumbly and turned into these, I think, mile-high clouds of dust. Okay, anyway, there's really nothing to speak to that here at this lonely rest area. I just stopped here because I thought it was kind of interesting to, officially mark the 100th meridian. And as messed up as it is, it feels good to me because I was born and raised in the West. So I'm used to this really dry air. I've been in Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma the last week or so, and it's very, to me, humid. Everything's green and alive and it's beautiful, but everything just felt kind of sticky and grimy to me. And it's only now that I'm crossing the 100th meridian that I feel like I can breathe again. I feel like my skin is going to dry back out to its normal leathery consistency. My hair is going to go back to being straw. I'm just going to feel like myself again. It's messed up, but that's just the way I was born and raised. But I'm kind of curious what life was like for these Dust Bowl settlers out here. I mean, I know a lot of them moved to California. In fact, I think something like 1 in 8 Californians today can trace their ancestry back to the Okies, which they weren't just from Oklahoma. I mean, that's a misconception. A lot of people think the Dust Bowl was just in Oklahoma. No, it was northern Texas, it was eastern Colorado, it was southern Kansas. In fact, it was Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri. There was a drought over a lot of the country back then. And my own grandmother, one of my grandmas, my dad's mom, she was an Okie, but she was from Missouri. She was from the boot heel of Missouri. And they came to California back in the 1930s. They piled all their goods on the back of their Model T wagon and drove all the way to California. And she was one of the lucky ones that made it. So yeah, one out of every 8 Californians can supposedly trace their history to somebody from this great migration, which I think is fascinating. It was the biggest migration in California history, even more than the gold rush. But not everyone left. There were some hardy souls who decided to stay here and wait out the drought. And I guess their patience paid off because the drought did eventually end. I think it started raining again in like 1936. And well, the government stepped in and did some kind of mitigating conservation corps tactics, like they taught people how to terrace their land, or I guess there's different farming techniques where you don't just strip off the topsoil. And they planted a bunch of trees. The government planted like 100 million trees as a sort of shelter belt to block the winds. I mean, maybe these could be some of the federal government's original shelter belt trees. I don't know. All I know is I've passed a ton of abandoned farmhouses driving through no man's land, and not all of them look old enough to have been abandoned during the Dust Bowl. So I thought it might be kind of interesting to stop and check a couple of them out. Okay, this is the perfect illustration of everything that went wrong in this part of the country. And it really does paint a classic picture. A dry well, a dried up farm, and dried up dreams. So during the Dust Bowl years, which I guess was roughly 1931 to 1936, I think those were the worst years of the drought, when these billowing clouds of dust were choking everybody out and they were all fleeing to California. Well, not everybody fled to California. There were some folks, they had sunk their whole life's work into building these. First they built a house out of sod, and then once they got a little bit of money together, they somehow got the money to go into town and buy wood. They were able to buy timber and then bring it back out and build a wood frame house. And a lot of them, these poor wives, their husband dragged them out there from back east, promising that they're going to make something of this land. We're going to have a farm, and don't you worry, honey, I'll build you a house. Next thing you know, she's living in a mud dugout. Well, don't you worry, honey, as soon as this crop comes in, I'm going to go to town and build you a real stick-built house. So they did. They built these homes, and they weren't just going to leave all that behind just because of a few years of drought. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years of drought. Some of these people actually did hang in there. Like this abandoned farm I'm poking around right now, it doesn't look like it's that old, actually. I mean, you can see the house. That's definitely much newer than the 1930s. So this place must have belonged to one of those hardcore pioneer families who decided to stick it out, wait around. Eventually it'll rain again. And they did, man. They hunkered down in those dust storms and they ate. Golly, I was just reading a book about it. I mean, some of them were so hard up they had to eat tumbleweed, pickled tumbleweed, and their cows were all dying. I'm curious what's in this. This looks like a real old building. Look at that. It's like stone and mud in the cracks, and it's full of tumbleweed. I guess this must be a house that belonged to some of those people who decided to stay here and make the best of it. And so it looks like they stayed until, golly, I'm gonna guess the 1970s maybe even. I mean, this house doesn't look that old. We'll go inside and see if we can figure it out. If I can get over there. I mean, I have to walk over this giant pile of collapsed rubble, which it looks like that was the garage. Look at that. Some kid played basketball on that basketball hoop hung on the front of the garage. Boy, talk about evocative. If this place isn't the very depiction of American carnage, I don't know what is. Holy moly, look at this place. I mean, the windows do look old, but not 1930s old. I'd guess this house was maybe built in the... Well, gosh, I don't know. Maybe it is. I mean, those old paint... Well, there's a crock. Can't be that old. Oh my goodness. Wow-wee. I gotta be careful. It's gonna take me forever if I look at everything on the floor. I was curious how long ago this place was abandoned, and this doesn't look like that old of a supermarket flyer. I mean, Campbell's chicken noodle soup was going for 3 for $2. Well, I guess that was before inflation. Oh my god, look at the kitchen. Holy cannoli. This is just heartbreaking. I don't know, man. This place definitely looks like it was abandoned way later than the Dust Bowl. But oh my god, look at this living room. Holy cow. This recliner is just like somebody got up and left yesterday. And then look at this cool chair. It's made out of an old barrel. I mean, I wouldn't want to sit in it now, but wow, look at the cool quilted pattern on the back. Oh man, this place is full of mold, man. It's a different environment out here. You know, I'm used to exploring this stuff out in the desert where I don't have to worry so much about black mold. But in a place like this, it's a different story. Oh my goodness. Oh no, look. A typewriter. How about that? Somebody sat there working on the great American novel. The Grapes of Wrath. Golly, all joking aside, I wonder who sat here and what they wrote. Oh no, look, there's a picture. Could this be the guy who sat at this typewriter? Aww. Golly, what happened? Well, he looks like he's straight out of the 2000s, so I'm gonna guess that the abandonment of this place... Oh, look, his old Stetson box from his cowboy hat. The abandonment of this place happened way, 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 way after the Dust Bowl. But whoever that guy in that picture was, his parents or his grandparents probably lived through the Dust Bowl. Oh, look. Pootie Tang. He had fine taste in movies. Oh, no, look. There's his boot. Golly. Oh, man, look. No, all his clothes are still hanging in the closet. Absolutely heartbreaking. Okay, as fascinating as it would be to poke around the debris of this poor man's life, I gotta get out of here. There is too much rat poo, black mold, and God only knows what else in here. So let's go back outside into the fresh air. Bah! Woo-wee, wow, that was wild. I didn't expect there to be anything in that house. You know, I've driven past a number of abandoned farmhouses out here. They're all over the place. And most of them are just, you know, empty shells. That place was another story. Fascinating. It adds layers onto this. You know, when I started making this video, I was just thinking about the people back in the 1930s, but it's true. Their descendants hung on here for decades. And it's sad to think what happened to that guy and why he eventually gave up, you know? I mean, I think the drought ended in like 1936. So it started raining again, and then the government had stepped in and helped them plant trees to block the wind and taught them these new farming techniques. And so I guess things kind of just went back to normal. In fact, I read online even that the price of wheat went back up, you know, decades later. And so some of the farmers started pulling out them trees. You know, the government planted 100,000 trees to block the wind. Well, some farmers started pulling them out because it was more profitable to plant more wheat. Okay. Wow. It's another abandoned farmstead just on the other side of the highway. And it looks to me like the house probably dates from the same era as the other one. But dang, look at this building. I mean, this looks like it really could have been here since the days of the Dust Bowl. Let's see if we can go in. Oh man, look at the amazing way it's closed. Holy wow. Okay, well, I guess it's not that old. Oh, it's got that same kind of big built-in sink like that other building. Maybe this is like the pump house where they got their water. You know, there's a big plumbing pipe there. This might be the, yeah, look, on the electrical, the well. So maybe this is what failed and caused this poor farm to dry up. I mean, they weren't able to suck any more money out of that delicious Ogallala aquifer. Wow, look at this. It's just straight out of a freaking movie. I mean, again, probably not from the 1930s, but probably not from that long thereafter. Let me zoom out, see what's in this one. Oh, I don't know. This place looks a lot newer. Look at that couch. The recliner. Shag carpeting. Bowling pin. Okay, wow, there is so much interesting stuff in here. But I don't have time to poke through everything. No matter how evocative a picture it paints. I can just picture the farm wife baking a bundt cake there in this sunny, spacious kitchen that unfortunately now is just a complete friggin' disaster. Oh my god, there's like a little baby stroller, like for a kid to play with. They had kids. Oh dang, look over here. You can see all the way down into their basement. What do you call it when you go hide from a tornado? Tornado bunker. Oh gosh, what's in here? I mean, if you can see through all the tumbleweed, there's some kind of real old-timey exercise bike. Oh, she was trying to stay fit. I love that. Anyway, these folks, I'm guessing, are the descendants. Let's see, if the Dust Bowl happened in the 30s, these are probably like the children of some of those farmers, you know? Oh my gosh. I totally had these fake farm animals when I was a kid, like these exact ones. Funny how certain things pop out at you. Oh no, look, here's the kids' room. No wonder that little pig was laying down there. There's a real crusty stuffed animal. There's a little toy horse. And there's even a little sweater hanging on the door. That is so heartbreaking with the little winter hat. What happened? Why did these people leave everything here? Golly, you can definitely tell there was a woman living here though, because look, she even left her hot rollers behind. Oh my god, look at that. And there's still even little bits of her hair on it. She was blonde. Wow. Okay, I've never seen anything like that in an abandoned place, but it does. I mean, it really paints a picture of this woman, you know, stood in front of this medicine chest, which her husband was shaving with Old Spice, and you know, did her makeup, did her hair, you know, she had them hot rollers. Look at this. Oh, this is deodorant. I thought it was hairspray. And so, yeah, those hot rollers date from like the 1980s or 1990s. But if you look at the bathroom, look at the way it's constructed. This is a really old house. I wouldn't be surprised if this house was around during the Dust Bowl. So, yeah, maybe the people who lived here were descended from the original Dust Bowlers, you know? I don't know what they called them, Dust Bowlers. You know, their parents lived here and they didn't want to leave, even though they were choking on dust and the fields were all dried up and the government was coming in and planting all these crazy trees. They had sunk their whole life savings into this area, and so where else are they gonna go? They stayed. And so their kids grew up here and really didn't know anything else. And maybe the kids hung on through the 1970s, 1980s, you know, those Farm Aid concerts. Maybe they got some help from the government. But eventually, I guess that well went dry. Something happened. You know, you think about the Dust Bowl as being ancient history, something that ended a long time ago. But in a way, it's a story that never really ended. And as long as folks continue to settle the arid half of the United States west of the 100th meridian, it will be a never-ending story. The never-ending story. Actually, I can think of a better song to sing since I'm leaving Oklahoma today, and I've been driving around the last couple of days in this beautiful no man's land listening to Woody Guthrie because, well, he wrote some of the most evocative folk music of the Dust Bowl era. Well, he had this one song in particular that I think will be very fitting to play or sing, as I'm driving out of here. And that is, so long, it's been good to know ya. So long, it's been good to know ya. So long, it's been good to know ya. This dusty old dust is driving me home. So I'd better be drifting along.